Welcome to the second part of Floodplain 101 for Realtors. My name is John Hayes. I will be the presenter for this today. So what are the objectives of this presentation? The general objectives of this presentation are to strengthen your ability to provide the best customer service to your clients and to assist local communities and residents with identifying and reducing flood risks. On today's agenda, we will cover Part 2, Understanding Floodplain Regulations. These are the regulations that are required in order for a community to have flood insurance. So let's take a look at the floodplain regulations in a nutshell. The purpose of the regulations are to comply with the minimum federal and state requirements so that flood insurance is available to the residents and property owners of the county. It also is to minimize the impacts of future development on flooding, since the more development you have in an area, the worse flooding tends to get. To minimize the impacts of flooding on properties and infrastructure so that when and if there is a flood, our community is able to bounce back more quickly and recover faster, and to preserve and protect the natural and beneficial functions of the floodplain to minimize the need for highly expensive flood control projects in the future. How do we do this? The regulations require that a floodplain use permit be acquired before any and all construction or grading activities within the floodplain. These include things like filling or fencing, grading, building, etc. The permits will provide the conditions that are necessary for safe construction that will, at a minimum, minimize the impact flooding will have on the property because of the approved improvements. It also provides a paperwork trail to demonstrate development and projects are being evaluated and standards are being met. What regulations apply? This really depends on where you are at. If you are in unincorporated Santa Cruz County or the city of Nogales, then you're going to fall under the county's Floodplain and Erosion Hazard Management Ordinance from 2001, as of the recording date of this video. If you're in the town of Patagonia, you will fall under the town regulations. Some aspects of the regulations will be very similar to each other, while others will be different. This is in part due to the fact that communities are strongly encouraged to have higher standards than what the state or federal governments require as minimum standards. Some communities have taken on certain higher standards while others may have taken on others, or they may have done the standards at a different level of being higher. When in doubt, really check with the appropriate community. Please keep in mind what the appropriate communities are. Just because the mailing address says one community doesn't mean the property is actually located within the city or town boundaries of that community. General basic requirements will include some of the following: getting a floodplain use permit, elevating a structure properly, documenting the elevations with a elevation certificate, and avoiding the placement of excess fill in floodplain areas. Specific conditions will and do vary from lot to lot, as the nature of flooding and the conditions on the lots can and are different. When in doubt, ask. Local regulatory floodplains. Santa Cruz County also regulates what we call local regulatory floodplain areas. These are areas of local flooding that are generally not mapped on the FEMA maps. They are regulated due to the fact that the county has had to expend public funds to address flooding issues in these areas in the past, due to a lack of consideration for the flow of floodwaters when those areas were developed and when construction occurred. If the county is going to expend public funds on addressing these issues, then it will regulate them to minimize the need for these expenditures in the future. So let's take a brief look at the National Flood Insurance Program. Let's start with the floodplain maps. What do they do? What do they tell us? How do we find them? The flood insurance rate maps and the National Flood Hazard Layer are available online. You can go to it through the FEMA Map Service website. You can find them on Google Earth. There are a number of different ways to find them. What they do is they identify the areas of high risk. They do not create them. This is one of the misnomers of the maps that a lot of people hold. The mapping is to show the areas that have been identified as having a risk. We're not creating the actual floodplain. That's actually a physical feature of the surface of the earth. It's not a man-made construction. So it's basically broken down into 3 different levels of risk. There's the high risk, and these are zones that are going to be labeled with A in the state of Arizona along riverine environments, or V if you're in a coastal area. There's the moderate risk area, which is the zone X shaded, sometimes referred to as the X500. Then there's the low risk area, which is the zone X, which is usually shown as either clear or white on the maps. They're used for various purposes, including regulations, insurance rating, and emergency planning. The maps have different levels of detail depending on the type of zone. Some are detailed study, meaning that there's been a lot of computer modeling, a lot of surveying work that's gone into them to generate that mapping. Some are approximate, where they've just gone off of the aerial photography and topography. Floodway and floodplain are a couple of terms that we use a lot in dealing with properties. They have very specific meanings that we should be aware of. The floodplain is the land area that is going to be covered during a flood event, and it's labeled with a zone designation, such as A or AE or AO. The floodway is the area of land needed to convey the exact same flood event without increasing the depth of water more than 1 foot. So what does this really look like? Because this is not an easy concept normally for people to visualize. This is a cross-section of a typical riverine floodplain. You can see by looking at the outer points that you have the floodplain, or the 100-year floodplain as it's shown here. Inside of that is an area that's shown as the floodway. And this is calculated by saying we're going to encroach or fill in the edges of the floodplain or the floodway fringe until we cause the depth of water in the floodway area that's left open by no more than 1 foot of increase. So we don't cause more than 1 foot of increase in the depth of water in this area. Generally speaking, when we look at the federal maps, we can look at them and use this table to determine what are the impacts of the different areas. So in the floodway, yes, flood insurance is going to be required. Same thing for the flood fringe. But if we're in the moderate zones or the low risk zones, flood insurance is not required, and permits typically are not required. If we're in the local regulatory, then it's a little bit different. Permits are required, but insurance isn't required, but we do strongly recommend that it be considered. So looking at the high-risk areas for the riverine areas, so the areas that begin with the letter A, what this really means is the following. Generally speaking, over the life of a 30-year mortgage, there's a 25% chance that that area will experience flooding. Flood insurance is required on buildings with a federally backed mortgage. Floodplain regulations apply, which means floodplain use permits are necessary for construction and grading work. We also refer to this area as the 1% annual chance flood, or the regulated floodplain or flood hazard area. The floodway, in reality, is the location where 90 to 95% of the mass and energy of the flood is concentrated. And it's usually where the fastest flows and deepest depths of the flood occur. we want to keep these areas clear of development so the floodwaters can pass through. And also, because of the volumes and velocities involved, sometimes they're carrying projectiles which will literally blow holes through buildings and knock buildings down. So from a safety standpoint, we want to keep these areas clear also. Insurance requirements don't change because of the floodway designation. In fact, that designation does not affect insurance at all. It is strictly a regulatory tool. So the most restrictive regulations apply to this designation. Under the Santa Cruz County Ordinance, if you look at Section 5.8 of the ordinance, no new construction or buildings or fill is allowed to be placed in the floodway at all. So there's some big misconceptions that hopefully this has already helped begin to address in your mind. When you hear the term 100-year floodplain, what do you think? Most people tend to think that's a flood that happens once every 100 years. This is wrong, unfortunately. A 100-year flood event is an event that has a 1% chance or a 1 in 100 chance of occurring in any given year. Moderate risk areas or low risk areas, the non-special flood hazard areas. Unfortunately, these tend to account for up to 20% of insurance claims nationwide. This is due to, in part, to the fact that not all high-risk areas are mapped nationwide. There are some areas that have not been mapped, in part because when the mapping was done, there wasn't enough infrastructure in the area or enough population in the area, or maybe no population or infrastructure in the area, which meant that it wasn't warranted to be looked at. Flood insurance is recommended but not required by law. However, your lender or the lender of your client may require it. We call this the golden rule. Generally speaking, in that situation, come talk to us, because you should not accept the insurance being force placed by the lender in that case, because it will probably be anywhere from 8 to 10 times more expensive than if you go see an insurance agent. Unless it's designated as local regulatory floodplain, floodplain regulations do not apply. This also includes what is known as the 0.2% annual chance floodplain, or the 500-year floodplain, and rarer events. So here is a typical map from the county's GIS system showing the floodplain areas. And this one's useful because it shows all of the high hazard areas. The blue with the dark stipple is an AO zone. It's an area of what we call sheet flooding. The dark blue is the AE zone, or a detailed study area. The dark blue with the hashing across it is the floodway. That's the no building zone. The lighter blue is the approximate floodplain, or the zone A floodplain. And again, this is another look at a map near that same area, but zoomed over to the east. And here we also have the local regulatory floodplains superimposed, so you can see where those are, and that's that yellow hashing. But isn't there another designation on the maps? Yes. It's designation for areas where the flood risks are undetermined, or it's Zone D, and it shows up as a yellow beige color on our GIS maps. It's usually reserved for areas of very low to no development potential, like national parks or national forest areas, or areas with little to no development and little to no development expected by the community in the near future. So you might end up with some questions from clients. Is the property in the 100-year floodplain, and what does that mean for me? The property has a higher risk of flooding over time. Structures with a federally backed mortgage will need flood insurance by federal law. And a floodplain use permit is required for any and all development in the property, even a remodel. Painting doesn't count. Replacing a broken window doesn't count. Changing a window from a small window to a bay window would require a permit. Again, it always helps to check with our office. If the client says the property is in a 500-year floodplain, what does that mean for me? The answer to that is the property has a moderate risk of flooding over time. Flood insurance is recommended, and some lenders may require it, but it's not required by federal law. Generally speaking, no floodplain use permit is required for development. If the property is in a local regulatory floodplain, what does that mean to the client? That means that it's in an area locally identified as being at a higher risk for flooding, but it's not mapped by FEMA. Because of that, flood insurance is recommended, but it's not required. Generally speaking, a floodplain use permit is required for development. So how can you or your client get the floodplain maps and the flood information for the property? You have a couple of choices. One is you can go through FEMA's Map Service Center, which can be found at www.msc.fema.gov. You can actually search by the address, the place, or even latitude and longitude for the map, and you can print what are called fermets, which are actually considered to be official copies of the flood insurance rate map. And this is what a fermet would look like. Again, it's just a portion of the flood insurance rate map that's printed out at a more reasonable scale. The maps are generally speaking 2 foot by 3 foot in size, whereas this fermet is printed out at a 8.5 by 11 or normal letter size page. Or you can get it from Santa Cruz County for the unincorporated county and the city of Nogales by stopping at our office and filling out a flood hazard information sheet. You can fill out the flood hazard information sheet online at the county's website. You can follow the link there, or follow the county's GIS for digital flood insurance rate maps and there's the link. You can also get to that if you go to the county homepage and put your cursor on the word services and then click county maps. If you do that, you will end up going to the DFirm maps event if you work your way through that system, and this is what you'll see. And you can actually search this map by address, by assessor's parcel number, and a couple of other ways, and you can find the property. But assessor's parcel number and address are going to be the two most common people will use. What about Patagonia? We offer the form for the town of Patagonia on our website, and we will pre-fill it for the town. But we are not the official information providers for the town of Patagonia. It's not the form is not official until the town manager or the town's floodplain manager have signed off on the forms. They have to sign the form. We, as a service to them, as a courtesy to them, we will pre-fill the form out for them, and we email it to them with a copy of the map. Now, from time to time, the maps change. The last big change was in 2011. However, there have been numerous small changes since then. Whether the map is being completely redrawn, such as happened on December 2nd, 2011, or FEMA is issuing a notice that a particular structure is out of the floodplain, the maps change. And this is in part because the maps are considered to be somewhat of a living instrument, in that floodplains are a dynamic system, and so we're trying to keep up with them and where the areas of hazard are. So some basics about the maps. To know where to find the maps is a benefit to you and to your clients, whether you're going to the FEMA Map Service Center or the county website or the Flood Control District office. Knowing what the flood zones mean can be very helpful. We've already covered those. And most importantly, everything can and most likely will change over time. This includes the maps, the zones, the insurance requirements and costs, and the floodplain regulations. So why do the maps change? Well, they can change for a couple of reasons. One could be a clarification. The maps are being refined because we have better data than the original maps had. We are actually doing this right now as I'm recording this on 3 watersheds in the county, the Carolompe Wash, the Calabasas Wash, both in Rio Rico, and the Keno Springs area. This is because FEMA has allowed us to use a new methodology that is more suited to mapping these types of floodplains, called a 2-dimensional model rather than the 1-dimensional model that they were originally mapped with. We can also have revisions where the map information is being changed due to changes in the area, usually associated with development or changes in flood protection, such as a new flood control structure or the channelization of the wash. So the base flood elevation is one of the most important pieces of information that you can see on the maps. It changes depending on where the property is located. It's shown on the maps in an estimated manner, but the exact base flood elevation is usually found in the flood insurance study itself, depending on the zone designation. It's used for permitting elevation certificates, letters of map change, and most importantly, it's used to help determine what flood insurance rates will be. The regulatory flood elevation is the elevation required by the state of Arizona. Arizona requires all new construction in substantially improved structures. These are structures that have been remodeled or had an addition or repair where the cost of the work in terms of materials and labor equals or exceeds 50% of the value of the structure prior to the damage or prior to the start of the improvements. And they're required to be 1 foot above the base flood elevation. So this is what we call the regulatory flood elevation. So if we look at it on this map, you see what the base flood elevation is, and then you note that the floor of the house on the left-hand side is just slightly higher than that base flood elevation. That would represent the regulatory elevation. So it's increased its elevation by 1 foot. So what sort of changes can happen to the flood zones? One of the more common ones that we see is a letter of map amendment, or a LOMA. This is usually a clarification on the FEMA flood map. It's usually tied to a structure, though it can be tied to a piece of land. It's usually for a single lot only, and it has to be on natural grade, meaning that fill could not have been added to the structure. It's used by the property owners to develop that a structure is not in the special flood hazard area and to receive relief from flood insurance requirements. It does require an elevation certificate or a survey by a registered engineer or land surveyor. It is generally fee-free except for the cost of the survey and or the elevation certificate. This is what a letter of map amendment would look like after it has been issued. So there would be a letter of map amendment determination document, either removal or non-removal. In this case, it's a removal for a piece of property in Rio Rico. Now, if fill is added to the property, that usually tends to be a bit of a problem in getting a LOMA. You can get instead a LOMAR, which is a letter of map revision. Basically, the long and short of it is what they're looking for in these is that the ground outside the structure is higher than the base flood elevation. If that's the case, then the building can be taken out of the floodplain. So looking at the letter of map revision, this is usually a change in the flood insurance rate maps. It's usually a larger change in the high-risk zone, structural changes like a bridge or a retention basin or a channel widening event or channelization event. the construction of a new subdivision or a new development that has an impact on the floodplain. It usually requires in-depth engineering analysis. It can remove properties from their flood insurance requirements. It can also change the base flood elevations as well as the delineation of the high-risk areas. So a really key difference between this and a LOMA is a LOMA, you don't see the change on the map. A LOMAR, you will see the change on the map. So this is a couple examples of a LOMAR that was done in the county to change the floodplain off of I-19 near Old Tucson Road. Other changes that can happen are conditional letters of map change. This is basically where FEMA comments on a proposed project. It's usually a tool for new developments to ensure that the proposed changes will be accepted by FEMA. You can also have a conditional letter of map amendment, a conditional letter of map revision based on fill, or a conditional letter of map revision. All of these are just FEMA commenting that yes or no, if the work is done based on the plans that were submitted, whether or not a change would be granted or what the requirements would be. So some client questions that we can answer. What if I think the house is above the flood level? The best course of action is to check with the Santa Cruz County Flood Control District. We can look to see if there's any records of map change or revision or amendment on file, and if we have any information that can support the property owner or the proposed owner in that matter to show that that is the case. If we can't supply that information, we can provide guidance and some information necessary to obtain a LOMA or a LOMAR. One of the things that we've mentioned before a couple of times is the elevation certificate. So let's talk about that. It's tied to a single structure on a property. So if you have a property that has more than one structure, you're going to have more than one elevation certificate required. It's used to demonstrate compliance with the elevation requirements for a floodplain use permit. It's used to determine insurance premiums by an insurance agent. It depends on the use and floods designation on whether or not it has to be completed by an Arizona registered land surveyor or an engineer. It also, copies of the completed form may be available at our office if they were part of a completed floodplain use permit. And this is only going to be true for structures in the floodplain built after May 1st, 2001 in unincorporated county or April 30th, 2004 in the city of Nogales. With that, we'll go ahead and end this presentation today. Again, my name is John Hayes. I'm the floodplain coordinator for Santa Cruz County. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. My phone number is area code 520-375-7830. My email is jhayes@santacruzcountyaz.gov. Thank you.